So a closer walk, that's a metaphor, okay? You'll get it. So one Sunday after church, I had preached this sermon that was really long and boring, and I was standing at the doorway at another church, and everybody just walked by me, didn't say a word, because it was terrible. But this one lady was always very gracious in her remarks, and she came up and said, your sermon really touched me today. It reminded me of the steadfast love of God. Well, I was thrilled, and I said, oh, please, no one's ever said anything like that about one of my sermons before. Could you tell me why it reminded you of the steadfast love of God? And she said, because it endured forever. That didn't really happen. It could. I'll take criticism anywhere I can get it. I had a retired pastor in one of my churches years ago, and he used to occasionally give little suggestions. They were very nice. And one time he came through and he just said, so what? Well, it kind of threw me aback. What do you mean, so what? I had a blank stare on my face. He said, when I hear a sermon, I want to hear the so what in that sermon. So what do I do now? Good question. Well, what we're going to do right now, I'm going to give you a rather long and enduring answer to that question, so what? And to do so, I'm going to use the story from John chapter 21, verses 1 through 19. It really is one of the better texts we have in the Bible that helps us answer the so what question. And it just happens to come at the end of John's gospel. It's basically saying, here's what you need to do now. And it's going to use metaphors, okay? I'm going to point out the metaphors in this story, which will help encapsulate what it means to be an acting Christian, someone who takes the so what and does something about it, rather than just a Christian in name only, what we call nominal Christians. We're going to try to become acting Christians if we're not already there. So, 3 metaphors I'm going to use. The first one is fishing. Fishing. Let's talk about it. In John chapter 21, the scene opens by the Sea of Tiberias. It is better known as the Sea of Galilee. We're in the post-resurrection part of the gospel readings. Jesus has been popping around here and there. Remember last Sunday or whenever we talked about doubting Thomas and all that? So, but people are still confused. They don't know what to do because he's here today, gone tomorrow, it seems like. And so there are 7 of Jesus' disciples. I counted them in the Bible, in that story, and they are standing on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And Simon Peter, of course, who was a fisherman, he decides to go fishing. And the other guys think, well, why not? What else have we got to do? So, and most of them were fishermen too, if you read the story. So they decided to go fishing as well. It's what they had made their livelihood on years before they became followers of Jesus, which we'll talk about that word in just a moment. So Peter's statement, I am going fishing, reads as a back to business as usual statement. We gave it a good shot. We gave it our best run. But now it's over, so let's get back to our normal routines. And so they fish all night long. And guess what? They caught nothing. And by the way, they didn't use rod and reels. They used nets. So they're trying their hardest, catch no fish. The next morning, Jesus does one of his appearing acts, and he appears on the beach and he yells at them, I'm going to paraphrase, the fish aren't cooperating, are they? And they said, no, they're not. So he tells them something kind of interesting. I mean, if you and I heard this from somebody, we would laugh. But he said, well, cast your net on the other side of the boat. I'm sure they're thinking, well, how's that going to help? But they do, and they catch a huge haul of fish. 153 fish. Now, I did a lot of research on this to find out what that meant, because it's got to be symbolic for something. What does 153 fish stand for? And there's all kinds of interesting theories out there, but I finally decided that what the 153 catch of fish means is that they caught 153 fish. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, am I? So later they come ashore and they have a really nice barbecued breakfast of fish and a little bread, sort of like the early Christian version of a communion service, fish and bread. Now, this is one of two stories in the Gospels where the disciples, with Jesus' help, make a miraculous catch of fish. The other story is found in Luke chapter 5. The settings are different. This is what interested me when I was looking at this past week. In Luke's story, Jesus is in the boat with them when he says, cast it on the other side. In this story in John, Jesus, again, is on the shore. So it's a little different. However, because both stories are so similar, I tend to think that they are historically connected, but they're just remembered differently. But the real question to me is, what are they trying to say? What is the meaning of these fishing stories in the Gospels? Well, I think the key to understanding them is found in Luke's account of the story where Jesus tells the very surprised Peter, because Peter was, he was a good fisherman, and here Jesus, who wasn't a fisherman by trade, telling him how to fish and very successful. So he tells this stunned Simon Peter, don't be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. And by the way, a very similar story is found in Matthew chapter 4, without the miraculous catch of fish in this story, but it's a very similar story. And here Jesus again tells Simon Peter, follow me and I will make you fish for people. The older version says fishers of men. We're trying to be inclusive. I will make you fish for people. So clearly these fishing stories are calling us to reach out to other people, to cast our nets far and wide in order to bring people into the realm of God. And when the fish aren't cooperating, we are encouraged to cast our nets on the other side of the boat. This is a metaphor for, if what we're doing now isn't working, then we should try something else. So my question to you, Immanuel United Church of Christ, is, are we a one side of the boat congregation? Think of that. And if we are, as Dr. Phil would ask, how's that working for you? So is it time to cast our nets a little wider? Maybe in other spots? I'm not talking about moving our building, by the way. Perhaps in unexplored fishing holes, looking for a new school of fish. Or are we content to just continue casting our nets in the same old places we've always cast them, knowing that at the end of the day, our nets will be relatively empty? I'm being vague here on purpose, but now I'm going to try to be clear. The ethnic demographics of this neighborhood, the area surrounding the church, as you know, has changed dramatically in the last few decades. The neighborhood in which this church exists no longer resembles the congregation, and vice versa, 100%, like it may have at one time. The very same time, so you have the changing ethnic demographics, you also have age demographics that are changing. The membership of this church, the average age is, I'll be nice, it's advancing. It's advancing. So am I. And all the studies in the world show that the religious and social tastes of younger generations are markedly different than from that of previous generations. So the question is, what kind of effort has been made to evangelize, to share the good news, and be inviting and welcoming to people who may not fit the historic, first of all, the historic ethnic demographic of Immanuel, or who, mainly because of their generation, they have religious and social views that differ from the traditional religious and social views of this congregation. What efforts have we made to cast our net a little wider? And as we seek to answer those questions, let's remember what Jesus told us to do, to cast our nets on the other side of the boat, which again means we should be willing to expand our invitation and include people we may not have previously considered as good prospects. So what? So what can we do when we leave here today? We can go fishing. We can go fishing. Second metaphor that pops up in this story is that helps us answer the so what question, is the metaphor of feeding. We like to eat in this church, don't we? And that's not a metaphor. But after their breakfast of fish and bread, the risen Jesus suddenly decides to put Simon Peter on the spot. He knows Peter had denied him 3 times while Jesus was being tortured and executed on a Roman cross. And so Jesus is there to help Peter balance out his cowardice and his unfaithfulness by quizzing him 3 times. And by the way, if you read the original Greek on this, the words that are used for the word love kind of interchange between Jesus and Peter. But nevertheless, Jesus asked him, do you love me? Do you love me? It sounds like, how many of you listened to Kiss back in the 70s? They had a great song, Do You Love Me? You never heard that, did you? But that's what Jesus asked. Do you love me? And Peter says, well, yeah, sure, no, duh. And he said 3 times. And each time he says yes. Jesus follows that by mixing metaphors. Here he's talking to a fisherman, and he's telling him, well, then go tend the sheep or go feed the sheep. Well, that must have confused Peter, the former fisherman. Peter, in fact, his feelings are hurt, but not because Jesus seems to be mistaking him for one of those lowly shepherd types. His feelings are hurt because Jesus feels the need to keep repeating the question about whether he loves him, and also keeps repeating, well, then go feed my sheep or go tend to my sheep. So feeding is a common metaphor in a faith context. It suggests 2 things. First, that we are called to be fed, to be nourished in our own faith and spirituality, but it also means that we are called to nourish people's faith and spirituality. We are called to do both. Unfortunately, human nature, we tend to put more energy into the first part, which is nourishing ourselves. We all want to be fed, right? I can't tell you how many times over the years where I've been in conversation with people talking about their participation in the church. A couple of times it's because people are leaving the church. And they would say, well, I just want to be fed. I just want to be fed in church. And a couple of times over the years, people basically said they weren't being fed from my preaching, which, okay, I get it. But I always found that a little bit self-centered, because I want to hear people say, I want to be fed so that I can go out and serve others or feed others, nourish other people in faith and spirituality. To explain really what I'm trying to say, I'm going to use a restaurant analogy. Since we're talking about this, the context here is one of a cookout, a breakfast cookout on the beach. But let's think of it in terms of a restaurant. Now, as your pastor, I'm sort of your head chef. We've got the other staff, there are other chefs, right? We've got plenty of people cooking and serving up meals and so forth. We get our ingredients from God through Jesus, who is our supplier, right? And as your chefs, we prepare the food to be served on Sunday morning and hopefully through the week. Now, what do you all do with the food that has been prepared and served? Now, you have 2 choices. First, you can play the role of a restaurant patron, and you can eat that food for your own nourishment and pleasure. Or second, you can play the role of a waiter. In other words, I've cooked the food and I'm ringing the bell, and you can come get the food and you can take it out and you can serve other people. In reality, you're called to do both. You're called to be fed and to feed others. So if you're not taking what is being served to you here at Immanuel United Church of Christ and sharing it with other people, then you are ignoring the so what question that my friend asked me so many years ago. We should be asking that question each and every Sunday. So what? So what do we do now with what we have received in church today? And answer that question by going out and serving others. Fishing and feeding. Together, these 2 actions lead to the third metaphor that we find in John chapter 21, the metaphor of following. If we are fishing for others and and we are feeding others, then we are following Jesus. Now, the word following may not sound like a metaphor to you because we say that all the time. We're trying to follow Jesus. But it is a metaphor because you and I don't literally follow him in a literal physical sense because he's not here physically. So we're not doing that. So it is a metaphor. For Simon Peter, however, following Jesus, it was sort of a metaphor, but it was also a little more reality. But for him, it literally meant following him in the manner in which he died, which was death on a cross, which is tradition says is the way that Peter ultimately died. So for us, though, following Jesus is less dramatic and far less dangerous, thank God. But it's just as important. We follow Jesus when we cast our nets far and wide to bring people into the realm of God. We don't have boundaries. We don't have restrictions. We just cast it out there and see what will bring in. And we follow Jesus when we take what we have been served here in our own congregation, we take it out and we serve other people. Fishing, feeding, and following. That is the answer to that question my friend, ex-colleague friend asked me years ago after a terrible sermon. So what? So what are we going to do now? And by the way, I realize that my sermon this morning somehow reminded you of the steadfast love of God.